he was a surrealist. He actually really believed there was no difference between the dream state and the waking state. And you could do whatever you want, kill, fly, whatever. That was his major madness. No question, he was insane. I think that congenital insanity was certainly there. Oftentimes when you get that stratospheric intelligence, there are problems, emotional problems. I think he was probably the victim of incest, either his mother or some other family member. And then the rejection by women, in his youth as a student. All of these things came together in a perfect storm to form this incredibly horrific monster.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzullo.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzullo. Today, we kick off the second season of our podcast with one of the most shocking and unusual stories ever told. That of Hollywood surgeon/serial killer George Hodel and his son Steve, who is today's guest. George Hodel's most notorious victim was Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, whose nude, surgically bisected body was found in a vacant lot in Los Angeles on the morning of January 15, 1947. George Hodel's son Steve knew nothing about the fact that investigators in the 40s considered his father the chief suspect. Ironically, Steve spent his career as a Hollywood homicide detective, and a spectacular career it was. Over 24 years as a homicide detective, Steve helped solve over 300 cases and was awarded with more than 75 commendations. But it wasn't until he retired in 1986 that he was confronted with his most important and difficult case, one that would shake him to his emotional core and cause him to uncover the shocking and horrible past of his own father. We're extremely honored to welcome Steve Hodel as today's hero behind the headlines.
So I got that proverbial 2 a.m. phone call living in Bellingham, and it was my stepmother, June, my father's wife, his fifth wife, and she was hysterical. She said, "Steve, the paramedics are here. Your father's collapsed. They've just pronounced him dead. Come down."
Yeah.
So I flew down to San Francisco. They were living in a penthouse suite on the 39th floor in downtown San Francisco. Did all the things you have to do to take care of a father's passing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very close to my father. He had been overseas for a long time, but had come back in the last 10 years of his life. He'd come up to see me in Bellingham. I'd go down, and he was in the past, he'd been this very mysterious man behind an iron mask kind of thing. And we had become close in the last decade. So I'm sitting there with June, and this is a day or two after his passing. And she comes out and she gives me a small little photo album, about 3 by 5 inches.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, "I think your father would want you to have this." And I'm going through it, and it's pictures of me and my family and my mom and my brothers, relatives. And then I come across a photo of a reclining, semi-nude woman with dark hair, young woman. And I said, "June, who is this?"
Yeah.
"I don't know, somebody your father knew from a long time ago." And for some reason, and to this day, I haven't figured this one out, but Black Dahlia comes to mind. It just kind of comes and goes.
Yeah.
I didn't think much of it.
Yeah.
A couple of days later, I'm on the phone to my half-sister, Tamar, in Hawaii. We're talking about the great man's passing and what a remarkable life he had. And she says, "Well, he was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder." And I said, "What the hell are you talking about, Tamar?
Yeah.
Where is this coming from?"
You'd never heard this before.
No, Tamar, and I had maybe 45 minutes of conversation in the previous 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
She kind of spun out in the bohemian and, sex, drugs, rock and roll and I kind of went a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
And we just really didn't have contact. She called me a few times when she needed bail on marijuana charges or something, but that was it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, of course, this was ridiculous. I said, hell, there's not, I can show he had nothing to do with that in 10 minutes, with my background.
Yeah.
And I didn't know really anything much about the Black Dahlia. I knew it was a famous LA unsolved.
Yeah.
I had seen the photographs going through the police academy. They had an hour thing where they show you the crime scene and the body and stuff. And that was it. I didn't even know her name, Elizabeth Short. Never any mention or any hints during my 23 years on the department.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, well, I'll take a look at it. And I started digging into it. And at that time I had been divorced. My girlfriend was living in LA. So I had her send me up a bunch of articles and stuff from the LA Times and LA Public Library and stuff. And I started going through it. And the next big shock was I discover that the suspect started sending in notes to the press, taunting them, catch me if you can type things.
Right.
Cut and paste notes, that sort of thing. And there was one note where was not disguised, and a lot of them were disguised handwriting.
Yeah.
This one, I looked at, it was on the front page of the newspaper that said, turning myself in on January 29th, had my fun at the police, signed Black Dahlia Avenger. And I look at it, and it's my father's handwriting.
Wow.
You know your father's handwriting.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Your viewers know theirs.
Yeah.
I knew mine. And I said, still, this can't be. What is he pretending to be, the suspect?
Yeah.
So I thought, shit. Well, I said, I'm going to have to relocate back to LA and do some serious digging into this and be able to clear him. There's got to be some answer to this.
Yeah.
So I went back to LA and started my investigation. Doors kept opening one after the other. And before I knew it, I had gone 180 degrees from where I thought I was going.
Mm-hmm.
And I had actually made a case. I went in secret to an active head DA, presented the evidence to him. And he said, the second shock, of course, was that he wasn't just the one killer. It was a serial killer.
Yeah.
And I'd come up with about 6 or 8 related crimes, what I call lone woman murders
Mm-hmm.
in LA at the time. And they all fit in. And the head DA, Steve K, said, well, you're probably right about the 8 murders. He says, I would file on 2 of them. There's enough evidence here to prove, and I could win it in court, that he killed Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia,
Mm-hmm.
and a second, a Jean French murder, the red lipstick murder, 3 weeks later. He says, those I could go to court and win. The others, you're probably right, but not enough evidence.
Yeah.
So with that, I said, okay, I'll write the book, and it kind of went from there. The book came out in 2003.
That's a pretty shocking discovery to find out that your father was a serial killer, basically. What was that like for you, emotionally, to find out that that's kind of a son's worst nightmare, right?
Yeah. I've been through every emotion you can think of since then.
Yeah.
And, but initially it was 2 parts of me. It was the son who loved his father,
Mm-hmm.
Following a path of wanting to know more about him. I knew very little about him. He was very secretive his whole life, and left us when I was about 10 or 11. He left the country.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he would come in and out and over the years and just briefly, hello, let's have a quick lunch or something. And that was it. And then he'd be gone. So I really knew very little about him. So it's a son who loves his father, but wants to know more about this remarkable, mysterious man.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've also got the other side, who's the trained, objective homicide detective, who's been there and done that and wants to strictly follow the evidence. So I kind of had to keep these 2 parts of me separate.
Yeah.
The loving son versus the objective detective.
Roughly 2 years after the Black Dahlia murder, construction workers in Los Angeles discovered the bludgeoned body of a 40-year-old registered nurse and former actress named Jean French in another vacant lot in Hollywood. Witnesses reported that they had seen her dining the night before with a dark-haired man with a small mustache, which matched the description of George Hodel. They also heard her and the suspect conversing in French and saw the suspect driving away in a 1936 or 37 dark-colored sedan. George Hodel spoke fluent French and drove a black 36 Packard. Written on Jean French's nude torso in red lipstick were the words, "Fuck you, BD," the initials of Black Dahlia, who was mentioned prominently in the news at the time. When you first found out, or you were first suspicious that he was the Black Dahlia killer, can you tell us about him and what you learned about his background?
George Hill Hodel was born in Los Angeles in 1907. He was the only child of his parents were from the Ukraine. Both parents were Russian Jews. My grandfather, his father, escaped he was about to be encrypted in the Russian army, which was hell for a Jewish man.
Mm-hmm.
And he managed to escape out and go to Paris. He met his wife, Esther, in Paris. She was a dentist, a practicing dentist in 1900 Paris, which was extremely unusual for a woman.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think that's... Yeah.
They fell in love. They came through Ellis Island in 1902 or 3 in New York for a year, and then they came west to Los Angeles. They had their only son. George was born in 07. He was a child prodigy, a musical prodigy. At the age of 9, he was playing his own piano concerts at the Shrine Auditorium. Highly gifted.
Yeah.
He had the top piano teacher in LA, and he said he was going to be a great pianist.
Mm-hmm.
Went to high school, public school in South Pasadena. At 14, he graduated. Highly intellectual, 186 IQ, 1 point above Einstein.
Wow.
Incidentally, that skips a generation, but my boys are in good shape. And he went to Caltech at 14. Well, he just turned 15.
Yeah.
And he's at Caltech. He's there for about a year. And not only is he highly intellectual and a musical prodigy, he's also very sexually precocious.
Mm-hmm.
Has an affair with a professor's wife. She gets pregnant and breaks up her marriage. She goes back east, has the child, which she aptly names Folly. And Dad, this teenager of 16 or 17 now, goes back, says, I love you, I want to marry you and raise the child. And the woman says, George, you're a child yourself. Get out of my life. This whole thing was a terrible mistake. Go away.
Yeah. Crazy.
So he still tried. He took for a short time, he took a job at a Boston hospital as an orderly and tried to convince her. And anyway, gave up, came back and got a job as a taxi driver, fake ID. You had to be 21. And he got fake ID and passed himself off as 21, was driving cab. Oddly, bizarrely, like everything else in this story, he's driving cab out of the Biltmore, which is a brand new hotel downtown, luxury hotel.
Yeah.
One of his partners down there is a guy named William Parker, who was going to law school and would ultimately become LAPD's greatest chief of police.
Yeah.
So he's driving cab out of there too. And then he gets a job as a crime reporter for the LA Record, which was one of the large newspapers back then. And he's riding around, this is of course during Prohibition, and he's riding around with the vice guys and they're kicking doors and he's writing these tabloid stories, the judge's wife with the young blonde is arrested and stuff.
Right.
And then he graduates and starts riding around with LAPD Homicide. And this is back in the 20s.
Yeah.
And again, tabloid stories, the bloody ace of diamonds next to the body and this sort of thing,
Yeah.
So he does that for a while. And then he starts double dating with another good friend of his named John Huston, who at that time was just the son of a famous actor, Walter Huston.
Yeah.
His father was a highly recognized actor in stage and screen.
Oh yeah, he was probably one of the best of his time. Yeah.
So they start double dating, and John is dating a woman by the name of Emilia, and Dad is dating a woman by the name of Dorothy. Well, after a couple of weeks, John and Dorothy fall in love. They switch, and they go off and they get married, and they go to Greenwich Village, New York. And Dad and Emily are looking at each other, and I guess Dad said, "It's you and me, babe." She gets pregnant.
Yeah.
And they go north to Berkeley, where he decides to enter pre-med. So he goes 4 years Berkeley pre-med. Then he goes across to UCSF, San Francisco, to get his MD. He also gets a job with the San Francisco Chronicle, writing as a columnist. And he writes these 14 long pieces abroad in San Francisco. He and Emily co-write these pieces. So he's working for the Chronicle. He gets his MD. He has another affair with another woman by the name of Dorothy, not the original Dorothy. She gets pregnant. First Emily has a child with him, Duncan, in 28. And they're having an affair. He has an affair with another woman, this Dorothy. They have a child in 35, Tamar.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's living with the two women and the two children. He gets his MD and he says, I need a little space.
Yeah.
And he splits from them, leaves them, and he goes to Arizona and New Mexico and works as the sole surgeon at a logging camp for the CCC. That was FDR's, one of his plans was the logging thing. So he did that for a while. Then he goes on and he's working as the health officer for the state of Arizona. And then he decides to come back to LA. And he comes back to LA. At this 7 years now have passed, and Dorothy and John have broken up after a 7-year marriage. Dorothy comes back to LA, hooks back up with George. And my older brother, Mike, is born in 39. I come along in 41. And my younger brother, Kelvin, comes along in 42. So Dad gets a job with the LA County Health Department as a social hygiene, quickly rises to the top, becomes the VD czar of Los Angeles. And he decides to buy a house befitting his position. And he buys the Soden House. Many of your listeners and viewers will know that. It's built by Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. And it's a Mayan temple in the heart of Hollywood.
Yeah.
5121 Franklin.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we move in, in 45, he buys it. We move in, and we're the three little princes running around. Dad's the king, Mom's the queen. He has all kinds of cocktail parties, all kinds of interesting artists, good friends with Man Ray, who's a famous surrealist artist. And then in 1949, there's a knock at the door. LAPD, Dr. Hodel, yes, you're under arrest for incest.
Wow.
He's arrested, and it's a big trial, high publicity trial. And it turns out that Tamar, my half sister, was staying with us that summer of 49, July. And she ran away. She's picked up by the police, and they're going to bring her back. And they say, "Why did you run away?" And Tamar says, "Because my life is so difficult."
Yeah.
What do you mean? And she discloses that she had sex with her father and 3 other adults present. They all had sex together. So it's a big scandal. And Dad hires Jerry Geisler, who was kind of the Johnny Cochran of his day, the go-to guy for any, top criminal arrests. So Geisler does his magic, and he and Neeb, his partner, work their magic, and they basically paint Tamar with a pathological liar brush. She's 14 years old, and she's got all these fantasies and stuff. And a 3-week trial. Now they've got 3 adults present who testify, to the facts. Well, 2 of the 3
who are witnesses
and involved they're actually accomplices.
Yeah.
So they made a deal with them. Testify, and we'll either drop the charges or lessen the charges. So they do. But despite all that, the jury comes back in kind of an OJ quick minute and says, not guilty.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out later I will discover that there was actually, looks like about a $15,000 payoff to the DA's office. And one of the things you got to understand about this time in LA, it was very corrupt. I mean, it was a real life LA Confidential.
Right.
So Dad is not guilty. Shortly after that, he takes off in the spring of 50, or the summer. He takes off, leaves the country suddenly, goes to Hawaii, becomes a doctor there. He's also a psychiatrist, and he starts counseling the criminally insane at the prison in Hawaii, the territory.
Jeez.
He marries a beautiful young, very wealthy Filipina. They have one child there in Hawaii, and then he goes on to Manila after a couple of years, has 3 more children with Hortensia, his wife. They break up after about 4 years, 4 kids in 4 years.
Yeah.
She gets a dispensation from the Pope. And he
How do you do that after having 4 kids?
beats the hell out of me, Lieutenant. So then he has an affair with his office manager. He gets into market research, becomes the biggest dog in all of Asia, and has offices in Tokyo, Hong Kong, Sydney, Taiwan, all over. Becomes the leading expert in market research, which was basically a new concept back then.
Right.
And becomes the leading expert in Asia. Has an affair with it and marries his office manager, June. And they travel together the world and stuff. And he's coming regularly every year. He comes 2 or 3 times a year in his market research to the United States.
Yeah.
And, it's one of these, I get a call at 4 p.m. Hello, Stephen, this is your father speaking. Get a hold of your brothers and let's have a quick dinner at, Century City Hotel.
Yeah.
And we see him for an hour or 2, and then he's gone.
Yeah.
So then eventually in 1990, he decides to relocate back to San Francisco, his beloved city. And he and June rent a penthouse suite in the downtown area. And I see him for the next 10 years, and we develop somewhat. I mean, he was never a warm fuzzy, but we developed much more of a relationship than we'd ever had.
When he was older and you were spending time with him, did you ever observe anything odd about his behavior, or were there any signs at all that he was harboring this, this other persona,
I got to tell you, there wasn't. I mean, if they were, I missed him because that would be the farthest thing from my mind.
Yeah, of course.
He never really displayed anything in my presence that would give me a hint that there might be something there. There was an incident with Mom.
Yeah.
We had just moved. We'd been evicted from our previous rental. We were in a new place, and the electricity hadn't even been turned on yet. And I came home, and it was dark. It was kind of like twilight, hard to see. And I come home, boxes everywhere. And I hear this noise in the Mom's bedroom, and I work my way through, and I go in, and here's this man, and he's having sex with Mom. He's behind her, and he's standing up, and he's got overalls on.
Yeah.
Looks like Farmer John,
Yeah.
And I said, leave Mom alone. And I run over and I pick up a lamp, and I hit him with a lamp.
Yeah.
And he backhands me, knocks me across the room and says, get away, boy. He says, your mother's nothing but a whore anyway.
Wow.
And gets off of her and pulls up his pants and leaves. And I look at Mom, and she's drunk, and I said, he's right, Mom. And I run away for like 3 days.
Wow.
I said, I want to go live with my father in the Philippines.
Yeah.
She says, you don't understand. Your father's a monster. He's done terrible things.
In the early stages of his investigation, Steve Hodel had no idea how evil his father really was. Back in 2001, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone of Columbia University developed a depravity scale from 1 to 22 to help criminal courts rank heinous, atrocious, and cruel behavior. Category 1 includes those who kill in self-defense. At the bottom of the scale, Category 22 is reserved for the most evil, psychopathic murderers with torture as their primary motive. In September 2007, after examining the criminal profile of George Hodel, Dr. Stone ranks Steve's father in category 22, Most Evil, which happens to be the title of a book Steve and I wrote about his father, which was published in 2009. Let's turn to Elizabeth Short and who she was and how she crossed your father's path.
Elizabeth Short was a young, naive young woman who was born in Medford, Massachusetts, raised there basically by her mother. The father, there was she had four sisters. So there were 5 girls and the mother. The father kind of split and abandoned them in the 30s. And his car was found by a bridge, and everybody kind of assumed he committed suicide. And that was kind of the story for a while. She dropped out of high school at 16. She was an attractive young woman. She went to Florida, worked as a waitress for a little bit, met a military guy. Now, this is during the war years, of course.
Yeah.
And she met a lieutenant there that she kind of fell in love with. He went overseas, and he was flying back, and the plane crashed, and he was killed.
Wow.
So she kind of distorted things, and she had this fixation of marrying Lieutenant Wright, falling in love, marrying Lieutenant Wright, and living happily ever after. So she came out west to Los Angeles, hung out at the USO's stuff, was dating soldiers and stuff, sailors. She went to a pharmacy, a soda fountain in Long Beach, where she was living for a while. And she'd go in there, and that's actually where her name came from. Some of the guys in there, a film had just come out called The Blue Dahlia, which was a kind of a noir film, 46.
Yeah, I've seen it.
So the guys in there kind of called her the Black Dahlia, kind of a spin-off. I don't quite know why. The Blue Dahlia was a bar, not a person. But anyway, that's what happened. And that's part of the myth that would develop. And so she hung around and then came to Hollywood and got into kind of dating for, dinner, that sort of thing. She wasn't, there's a whole lot of myths about her that are simply not true. She would, a lot of these films and stuff and books turn her into a prostitute and a hustler and giving sex in the alleys. None of that's true. She was a rather naive, she was a 22-year-old by then, looking for love, and none of the other stuff was true.
And looking to marry an ex-GI, which LA was filled with at that time.
It was. Every street corner had a bunch of soldiers and sailors on it.
Yeah.
And that was her dream. And she was a fantasist. She would make up stories and stuff, tell people that she'd been married to a lieutenant, and they had a son, and they both died. And, so she made up lies. I mean, she was never, one of the other myths was she wanted to be in the films, and she was an actress in bit parts. None of that's true. I think what happened was guys that were dating her said, "You're so beautiful, you should think about going into the movies." That sort of thing.
She was very striking in her photos.
Yeah, she was. I mean, she was very attractive and also very naive.
Yeah.
Gullible.
Yeah.
So as far as Dad is concerned, she was active sexually.
Yeah.
But it wasn't prostitution or anything. And she would sleep on occasion with these guys. And come to find out, she developed some sort of a sexual problem. I don't know exactly what it was, Bartholin cyst or something.
Yeah, that's cyst. Right.
Yeah. And she went to an unknown doctor in downtown LA. Well, Dad had his First Street clinic, which is a private clinic down there. And so I always suspected that he was, one of the suspects is an unknown doctor in downtown LA.
Yeah.
So I always suspected that was George, and that's probably how they met. Another thing I discovered was Man Ray was very close to George, and I would later connect some paintings, a painting by Man Ray to Elizabeth Short in 43, as early as 43.
So she posed as a model for Man Ray.
Right, in this surrealist painting he did called L'Equivoque. And it also plays a very important part in later crime signatures.
Yeah.
But at that point, he did the painting, and I think that either Dad introduced her to Man Ray, or Man Ray introduced her to Dad. I don't know which.
Yeah.
But at any rate, they dated. They definitely dated. We wouldn't actually be able to confirm this until we got into the secret files. And in those secret files, they actually, law enforcement named George Hodel and say they were dating and did in fact date.
Violence and police corruption were so prevalent in late 1940s LA that the public demanded that an independent jury be impaneled to look into the city's many unsolved murders, including that of Elizabeth Short. By the spring of 1950, DA investigators zeroed in on George Hodel as the prime suspect. Soon after compiling a case that he felt was rock solid, lead DA investigator Lieutenant Frank Jameson was ordered to shut down his investigation and turn over all evidence, recordings, and interviews to the LAPD. 13 of those interviews disappeared from both the LAPD and district attorney's files. But enough evidence remains in the DA's files to clearly point the finger of blame for the Elizabeth Short murder at George Hodel.
Steve K., the DA that said he'd file it, and I do a presentation to LAPD, the top brass, shortly. This is before the book ever came out.
Yeah.
And basically, we present all of the evidence, all the linkage and stuff. And then that's, of course, starts a lot of newspapers and things jump on it and, go to LAPD and say, hey, what's about this? Well, Steve Lopez, who's a well-known columnist for the LA Times, he goes to LAPD and says, hey, there's this Hodel, and he says his daddy's the Black Dahlia killer, yada, yada. What can you tell me? And LAPD says to Lopez, go away. We don't talk about unsolved cases that we're working on. Well, they hadn't worked on it for 50 years. But anyway, and they also say that a lot of the reports are missing and stuff, have disappeared and stuff. So he goes, to his credit, he goes to Steve Cooley, who's the DA of Los Angeles. He says, hey, Hodel, Black Dahlia, yada, yada. And Cooley says, well, I'm not spending a dime of taxpayers' money on a 60-year-old case.
Yeah.
And he says, but, there is a box in the vault downstairs on the Black Dahlia. Would you like to see that? Lopez says, yeah. So Lopez goes downstairs. They open the vault, and Cooley gives him this box, and he goes upstairs, sits down in a room, and opens the files. Out falls a picture of George Hodel. And he says, whoa, he was a suspect.
Wow.
So he goes through quick and dirty, like most newspaper men. He's a columnist. He's got a lot of stuff, and so he goes through real quickly and says, he does a couple of articles on it, saying, he was. He says, actually, they bugged the Hodel house, LAPD and the DA's office, and they, he made some incriminating statements and da-da-da. But it was quick and dirty,
Yeah.
So I go downtown to the DA and say, hey, can I see the files?
Yeah.
Well, I let him. I guess I got to let you.
Yeah.
To his credit. And I spent the whole day copying, and there was 600 pages of Hodel-related stuff.
Wow.
So I bring that back, sit down for 3 or 4 months, go through it, and then I present it. And what do we discover? We discover that the 49 grand jury says, hey, there's all these murders that aren't being solved. It looks like there may be some kind of a cover-up. What's happening here? They actually order it taken away from LAPD and given to the DA to investigate. That's a very unusual. I've never heard of it before or after. And the DA, a Lieutenant Jameson, is put in charge. He starts investigating, forms a 18-man team. Actually, LAPD says, well, we got to be on this too. So they split it, half LAPD, half DAs. 18 men, 24/7, around the clock. They go out, pick up George Hodel at our Mayan temple, and take him downtown. And while he's downtown being talked to, they break into the house. Incidentally, I would later discover in the files that we were away. Mom and we 3 boys were living with her brother for 3 weeks. So Dad was there alone during the commission of the murder. And they break in and they put live microphones in the living room and the bedroom. not phone taps, actual live microphones. And they run a hard line to the basement and then out, and they hook it up to the telephone lines and run it to Hollywood Station, of all places, which is about 3 miles away.
Yeah.
Sit in the basement, 18 detectives, 24/7, 2 6-hour shifts for 6 weeks.
Wow.
And they're listening and monitoring these live conversations.
Yeah.
And the third day into the stakeout, on February 18th, there's a conversation with Dad and another guy, a Baron Haringa, I would later identify him as, who's a friend and accomplice he'd known from the 20s forward. And they're basically talking about, first Dad talks about killing his secretary. Well, he'd been investigated by LAPD 2 years earlier for killing his secretary.
Yeah.
And they couldn't prove it. They put an forced overdose of Seconal.
Yeah.
And in that, he talks to him and he says, covered her mouth, took her to the hospital. Maybe I did kill my secretary, but they can't prove it now. She's dead.
Yeah.
And
so he admits to one murder right there.
That's the one murder right there. And also, Mom had revealed the fact that she told this to Tamar when Tamar. This was actually the reason Tamar ran away. Was Mom told her, "You've got to get out of here. Dad's, your father is crazy." And then she tells her the incident about Ruth Spalding, the secretary. She says, "I got a call from Dad. He was at her apartment. I went down. He gave me some manuscripts that she was just going to disclose, and he told me to burn them." And Mom says, "I did burn them. I took them home and I burned them." And apparently they were going to reveal what the secretary knew about him.
Mm-hmm.
And either that was the fact that he was with Elizabeth Short, although this was earlier. So, he'd been dating her. So it could have been Elizabeth Short, but later, some of the other crimes I discover is more likely what she was going to reveal. At any rate, he overdoses her, takes her, and when she's comatose, she literally dies 20 minutes later after being taken to the hospital. He knew they couldn't recover her.
And your mother knew this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She was actually an accomplice. So he had her by the short hairs in regards to, if you say anything or tell anything, you're an accomplice to murder and you're going to go to prison just like me.
Yeah.
And there are a whole bunch of other things that I would later discover that she was actually involved in some of the stuff unwittingly, but, not an active participant, but there. For example, Elizabeth Short, I would discover when I interviewed one of the most amazing interviews I ever did was with a Merle McBride, who was a retired policewoman, and she lived in San Diego. And I went down and talked to Merle, and here's the son of the killer talking to the person that last saw Elizabeth Short alive.
Yeah. And
she related this story to me that just the days before the body was found, that Elizabeth Short came running out of a downtown bar up to her and said, "There's a man that's threatened to kill me. He's in the bar." And police and McBride goes with her. They go back to the bar. The man's gone, but her purse is there. She gets it.
Yeah.
And then a couple of hours later, McBride's still on her street shift. I'm forgetting the words for
the beat. Yeah,
a beat, a downtown beat. Yeah. And how soon we forget.
Yeah, they don't do that anymore.
And she sees her walking out. This is like 3 or 4 hours later. She sees her walking out with 2 men and a woman from another bar. And she goes up to her and she says, "Are you all right?" And Elizabeth says, "Yeah, I'm going to meet my father at the bus station in a little bit." She says, "Okay." Well, that's literally the evening of her murder.
The morning of January 5th, 1947, was particularly cool and overcast for Los Angeles. At around 10:30 a.m., a woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter in the Leimert Park section of the city, just 5 miles south of Hollywood, when she caught a glimpse of what she thought was a store mannequin lying in the brown grass of a vacant lot. Stopping to take a closer look, she recognized that a nude woman's body had been dumped a few inches from the sidewalk. Betty Bersinger grabbed her daughter and ran to a nearby house and phoned the nearest police station, which sent out a bulletin reporting a possible drunk in a lot at 39th and Norton. What stunned police officers discovered instead was a severed, naked female corpse lying spread-eagled in the grass. Within days, the body was identified as belonging to a 22-year-old woman named Elizabeth Short.
One of the main things that made this one of LA's most infamous homicides, if not the most infamous, was the fact, the horror of what was done to her. She was surgically cut in half with a medical procedure known as hemicorporectomy, where you can only divide the body without sawing through bone by going through the second and third lumbar vertebrae. And the body was carefully posed. Many wounds were inflicted on the body, pieces of flesh. The left thigh, about a pound of flesh was cut out of the left thigh and inserted in her vagina. They found other items from the body inserted in her anal cavity. A large ear-to-ear cutting was done on her face. And this is, a lot of people misinterpret this because when you see the pictures of it, it looks like a jagged, cut, but actually it's a very well-rounded scalpel cut.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was they put sutures in the mouth at the coroner's office to close it, which gave it this effect.
Okay.
But actually it was very well-rounded.
It was almost like a Joker smile then, right?
Yeah, it was more after a surrealist painting, but the body was crisscross cuttings on the right thigh, very distinctive, unusual crisscross pattern on the right thigh. The right breast was completely excised and removed.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these things would later become identified with surrealist paintings.
Mm-hmm.
Man Ray, his close friend, had done, the arms were posed above the head in a surrender position, and the lower part was juxtaposed just off inches to the right of the upper half. So it was carefully posed. It wasn't just dumped there. It was carefully posed. And Man Ray did a couple of paintings, and one was called The Lovers, which was a pair of lips, and they go across the horizon. And this was, I believe, was in imitation of the slashing of the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
He also did another painting called The Minotaur,
Mm-hmm.
which was was their mascot. The surrealist mascot was the Minotaur,
Mm-hmm.
who was the monster, the half man, half beast from Crete,
Yep.
who devoured young maidens.
Yep.
And he was their mascot up to the surrealists. And the body, he did this basically painting a photograph where a woman is cut in half, hands above her head in the surrender position. And I believe that that was, Dad posed that after his Minotaur photograph. Later on, other surrealists would identify various things, giving knowledge that they knew. William Copley was a close friend of Man Ray's,
Mm-hmm.
and he lived in Hollywood and was with Man Ray most of those years and went with Man Ray back to Paris. He did a painting called It's Midnight, Dr. Blank.
Yeah.
And it shows a nude woman in a bathroom, which is identical to the bathroom at the Franklin House. And basically, he has surgical instruments next to it, and they actually spell out Hodel, Hodel.
Wow.
If not knowing any of this information, it would mean nothing other than appears to be surgical instruments.
Yeah.
When you actually see it, it's actually Hodel.
Wow.
So, and on and on it goes. The Étant Donné is another famous surrealist painting by Duchamp.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have probably done to mimic George Hodel's. It's a nude woman on a vacant lot, dead. Apparently, it was an homage to George.
Yeah.
And there's other paintings that go on with, I've probably got about 7 or 8 now that are linked to him. So this was a major crime signature, and what I call murder as a fine art.
Yeah.
And this was part of his pathology, was doing this and playing these games and taunting the police with these hidden secrets and stuff.
In 2006, art historians Mark Nelson and Sarah Hudson Bayliss wrote a book called Exquisite Corpse, published by Bullfinch Press, in which they traced, through visual comparisons and historical research, the profound connections between surrealistic art and the Black Dahlia murder. In their very compelling book, the authors suggest that the work of prominent surrealists, including Man Ray, Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, and others, may have inspired George Hodel, and proposed that some of the artists appear to have referenced the Black Dahlia murder in their later works.
So back to the stakeout. So he talks about, supposing that he says on these are recordings, and I'm reading these transcripts, and I can't believe it.
Yeah.
And supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. My secretary's dead.
Yeah.
So, Ruth could have mentioned that they were lovers and stuff.
Yeah.
And it goes on and on with other stuff. He says, this is the best payoff between law enforcement I've ever seen. Don't cop out ever. We're just a couple of smart fellows.
Yeah.
And on and on. But the real kicker and the reason for the cover-up, which I lay out, is basically, I'm reading the reports and I can't believe it. It says, this is the transcript. It says, Hodel and the Baron go downstairs to the basement. Blows are heard. A woman screams. More blows are heard. A woman screams again. Then it's silent. And I'm saying to myself, why aren't the two detectives that are listening to this out the door over there and doing a rescue? They're 5 minutes away.
They're listening to a woman getting murdered.
They do nothing. It's either a serious felony assault, but more likely, I think it was a murder.
Yeah.
Because also he says, don't leave a trace of anything.
Yeah.
So they have a murder on tape.
Yeah.
And you've got to understand the history of LA and the timing. Chief Parker is literally weeks away from becoming the next chief.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to clean up Dodge and get rid of the corruption. And basically, he knows if this comes out, he won't be able to take power and stuff and do the things he wants to do.
Yeah.
So I think there was some midnight oil being burned at City Hall with the DA and stuff. And they said, look, let's lock this away for now, take power, do what we need to do, and then come back to it at some future time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they did.
Yeah.
Basically. And kind of for the good of the city, for the good of themselves and the department.
Yeah.
And then, of course, later we get to confirm this. All of the top brass confirmed the case was solved, and they named George Hodel.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want me to read the actual quotes from these guys.
Sure. Yeah.
Parker, we identified the Black Dahlia suspect. He was a doctor. And of course, we know from the files that doctor was George. Thad Brown, chief of detectives. The Black Dahlia case was solved. He was a doctor who lived on Franklin Avenue in Hollywood. Now, maybe it was another doctor on Franklin, but I don't think so.
I don't either. Yeah.
Lieutenant Jemison, we know who the Black Dahlia killer was. He was a doctor, but we didn't have enough to put him away. Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
But he was ordered to send the case back to LAPD.
Yeah.
And then the undersheriff, the Black Dahlia case was solved. It'll never come out. The suspect was a doctor they all knew in Hollywood involved in abortions. And in the tapes, Dad talks about committing abortions and stuff, which was a felony back then, and that would send you to prison for 5 years.
Yeah.
So, all of this. And then, of course, since then, I've come up with so much. This is why there are 8 books. I've actually been able to link physical evidence from the Franklin house to the crime scene, which was remarkable. And
wow.
We had a cadaver dog alert to, I think they're either bodies buried near the property or in the basement. One of the big physical evidence connections linkage is, again, doors keep opening. So decided I'm going to do a little research on Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., Lloyd Wright. So I go to UCLA collections, special collections, and I get, and then there's a file on Lloyd Wright. So I'm going through it. And within that file, here's a file on George Hodel, right?
No kidding.
And I open that up, and here's actual well, of course, Dad had Lloyd Wright do the reconstruction because he wanted it to be pristine and as it was.
Right.
So he hired him to do the work. And I'm looking there, and here are receipts for bags, 50-pound bags of cement and landscaping bags that, and I look at the date on them, and this was a bill to George from Wright.
Yeah.
And I'm looking on the date, and it's January 10th, 1947.
Yeah.
So 3 days, basically days before the murder.
Yeah.
And the body, LAPD discovered that the body was actually transported on 50-pound bags of cement, empty cement bags, and a bag of manure, 50-pound bag of steer manure.
Yeah.
And the body was transported, the two halves, she was surgically bisected. Two halves were transported in a car, and the bags were left by the body with blood on them and stuff.
Yeah.
And one of them was steer manure. Well, she had been force-fed feces.
Oh.
During the autopsy, they found feces in her stomach.
Yeah.
With green material that they couldn't identify. Well, this bag was fertilite, which contained green particles.
Yeah.
But clearly part of his torture, and she'd been tortured for 4 hours.
Yeah. Pieces
cut from her body. It was horrific. Anyway, she was force-fed feces, which was the steer manure.
Yeah.
So now we've got him linked,
Yeah, yeah.
So it's just amazing how much has unfolded since.
Let's talk about the motive for a minute, because you found that there was like a very specific reason that your father was mad at Elizabeth Short.
So Dad had gone over to China in 45, and he was going to be there till 40. Let's see, he went over in 40. No, I'm sorry, he went over in 46, and he was going to be there till mid 47 or 8. So he goes over, and he's actually appointed a lieutenant general in China, and he's working there. And
as a doctor, right?
As a medical doctor, he's working for UNRWA, United Nations Rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And he's over there, right after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And he's given a Jeep, and he's given a cook and an assistant and stuff, and 3-star flag in the Jeep, and he's riding around doing all this stuff. And so he's over there. Well, come to find out, in the secret DA files, Elizabeth Short is back in Chicago, and she's interviewing various newspaper men. She's actually sleeping with them, and she's investigating some crimes back there, the lipstick murders.
Yeah.
And these were 3 different murders. One was a little girl named Suzanne Degnan, 6-year-old, and they were all linked together, and she was investigating them for some reason. We don't quite, I think it was because she found out something that pointed to George as the probable suspect.
Yeah.
So he's in China. She's back there trying to get information, sleeping with 3 or 4 different newspaper guys, asking about the Degnan murder and lipstick murders and stuff. And I think what happened was somehow Dad found out that she was, through some way, some informant, some friend,
right.
that she was investing. And he quits his job there at UNRWA, suddenly comes back. She starts running and hiding and saying a man's going to kill her. And within several months, she's dead.
Yeah.
So I think this was his reason to come back, to silence her.
Right.
And this is actually documented in the actual DA reports.
Elizabeth Short must have known something troubling about Steve's father that maybe he let slip during an intimate moment or while under the influence. And this information was so disturbing that it caused her, a naive young woman with very little money, to travel to Chicago in the summer of 1946 to try to obtain information about a series of horrific murders that had taken place there. According to documents in the LADA's file, Elizabeth Short's trip to Chicago most probably sealed her fate and caused George Hodel to return to Los Angeles from China, hunt her down, and end her life, making her one of the most infamous murder victims in history. So she goes back to Chicago while he's gone in China to investigate these other murders.
Right.
You've linked those murders also to your father in terms of there's a lot of evidence linking those murders to your father.
There is.
So somehow she found out about your father being involved in these murders. We don't know how.
Or suspected. Yeah.
Or suspected. And she goes to, she has no money, really. She's living hand to mouth. But
Right.
somehow she she's curious enough that she goes back to Chicago to try to find out what she can about what the police know about the suspect in those murders.
Right.
Then George comes back, and a couple weeks later, she's dead.
One of Dad's crime signature MOs was street signs.
Yeah.
And he was playing these games where he was, a lot of his victims were posed, which is very unusual. Posing is about 1% of all murders.
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself was unusual. So the street signs I start to discover is, so the little Degnan girl, she's surgically bisected. In fact, the autopsy surgeon back there said, I'm not as good a surgeon as whoever did this.
Yeah.
She went between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, which is called a hemicorporectomy. It's a procedure to divide the body. Anyway, her body parts were hidden in sewers right near the murder location. And her body parts were posed off a street named Hollywood.
Yeah.
Because okay, coincidence, George is a Hollywood doctor, no big deal,
Right.
So then in the Elizabeth Short, a year later, almost to the day, Elizabeth Short's murder is posed off a street named Degnan. What's the little girl's name? Degnan, right?
Yeah.
Say, okay, well, still,
No, that's pretty hard coincidence.
But it doesn't stop there. I mean, it's like, I'd never even heard the name Degnan before.
No.
Anyway, and then when he goes to Manila, he also does a surgical murder of victim Lalou, and her body is posed off a street. Well, first he does the French murder, Jean French, 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
And he poses her body off a street named Mountain View, okay, on a lot.
Yeah.
Beaten to death, strangled on a lot in West LA. And just 10 days before that, Elizabeth Short was buried at Mountain View Cemetery.
Wow.
Okay, so Mountain View Street, another clue.
Yeah.
Then we go to Manila, and he poses the murder victim there on a vacant lot, surgically bisected, the same deal. It's a Black Dahlia copycat murder, or not copycat, but and poses her body off a street named Zodiac.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, no way, this can't be. That I didn't know anything about Zodiac.
Yeah.
But I said, this is ridiculous. But I said, well, at least I got to check it out.
Yeah.
So that would lead me into Most Evil, as you know, lead us into the initial Most Evil.
Right.
Where we came back and said, well, there's not enough here to say he did it, but he needs to be looked at as a suspect.
Yep.
And put on the top of the list for all of these reasons.
With the Zodiac killings. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And basically, then Most Evil 2, we would actually come up with additional information that would definitely show he was Zodiac, along with the profile. Well, I guess in our book, we came up with the comparisons, didn't we? We found the two additional drawings that were picture perfect to George Hodel.
That's right.
Anyway, that's a whole nother interview story.
We could do that another time. Yeah, that's another
but the
incredible
linkage,
story.
The street sign showed this, showed one of his crime signatures playing games and taunting the police.
Yeah.
The other had to do strictly with surrealism.
Yeah.
And in Dad's heart of hearts, in his dark heart, he was a surrealist, and he wanted to be an artist.
Yeah.
And he was very close friends with Man Ray for 10 years. Well, Man Ray was in Hollywood. And actually, Man Ray and many of the other famous surrealists, knew that George had committed this crime. I'm not saying they were involved. I'm saying after the fact.
Yeah.
And each of them in their own ways did a painting to acknowledge it and show the clues that they knew that George Hodel was the killer. And this was all part of his dad. Really, the difference between the surrealists and George was they had their red wine, they drank their wine and, talked the talk. but he walked the walk.
Yeah.
He actually really believed there was no difference between the dream state and the waking state.
Mhm.
And you could do whatever you want, kill, fly, whatever.
Yeah.
And that was his major madness, and no question he was insane. I think that congenital insanity was certainly there. Oftentimes when you get that stratospheric intelligence, there are problems, emotional problems. I think he was probably the victim of incest, either his mother or some other family member.
Mhm.
And then the rejection by women, in his youth, a student.
Yeah.
All of these things came together in a perfect storm
Yeah.
to form this incredibly horrific monster.
Homicide detective Steve Hodel grew up never suspecting that the father he loved and longed to connect with was a vicious serial killer. It's a story that grows deeper and more psychologically fascinating the further one looks. Here's one example. The reason Steve joined the LAPD in the first place was at the suggestion of his first wife, who he later learned was more than a decade older than she told him she was, and had previously been an intimate acquaintance of his father. To date, Steve has written 8 books about his father's many crimes. In 2009, he and I collaborated on one of them, the bestseller Most Evil, which traces the connections between many of George Hodel's murders across the United States and overseas. It takes tremendous courage to do what Steve has done, uncover the ugly truth of one's father and family. He's done so with great investigative skills and determination. For these qualities and others, he's today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzullo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Orchestra and score provided by Extreme Music. Please comment, like, and subscribe to Heroes Behind Headlines.